What kind of performance gains can we expect when we overclock the Intel Skylake Core i7 6700K and the NVIDIA GTX 980 Ti? Well, let's take a look. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Go-To Tech Reviews. Thanks for joining us today. We are now going to be taking a look at the performance gains that I got on my own personal rig, which I've named Bahamut, when I overclock it. Now, not everyone's into overclocking or even necessarily understands it all the way. Now, this video isn't necessarily going to be about how to overclock your system. There's a lot of details involved with that. We're not going to go over that in this episode, but we're just going to look to see what the end results can become. Now, some of the overclocking that I did do is more on the mild side. Well, maybe medium. I didn't push it all the way. I tend to favor lower temperatures and better stability. I could have pushed it more, but I really didn't want to. And for the sake of this video, I just wanted to show what can be achieved even with a medium overclock. I didn't necessarily win the silicon lottery, but that's just how it works. So let's just jump right into it. We'll take a look at the synthetic benchmarks and look at some gaming benchmarks as well. But first, let me introduce you to my system and some of its specs. Alright, so let's take a look at the specs of my system here. So we went with the Intel Skylake Core i7 6700K processor with the MSI Z170A Gaming Pro motherboard. Next we have the Corsair H115i Extreme Performance Liquid CPU cooler with the EVGA NVidia GTX 980 Ti video card, along with the Crucial Ballistics Tactical DDR4 2666 and the Crucial M600 1TB SSD. Now, no good benchmark would be valid without Cinebench, really. It's much more CPU bound, so the GPU overclock makes little to no difference at all here. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I ran at both the stock and overclock settings, and my overclock for the CPU, which is a little bit lower than I would have liked. I can get away with 4.7, but I really have to crank the voltage, and the overclock setting I was most comfortable with was 4.6 gigahertz at a V-core of 1.32 volts. I mean, that gives me reasonable temperatures around 70 degrees Celsius max. But when we're looking at the Cinebench scores, what we were able to achieve on stock was 843 and overclock was 968. That is a performance gain of roughly 15%, which is about what I would expect. Next, moving on, is the 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme workload. This is much more GPU bound, though the physics portion does take into account the CPU as well. So the overclocking settings that we had here for the GPU were plus 250 megahertz on the core and plus 250 megahertz on the memory clock with 107% power limit. So let's take a look at the scores we got here. And we got, on stock, we got 7723, and overclock, we got 8950, which is a performance gain of roughly 16%, which is about what I would expect to see as well. Next, we have the Unengine Heaven benchmark. This is kind of a combination of CPU and GPU, so it gives kind of a better overall look at what we have going on with the system. So this will show better the combined efforts of the GPU and CPU overclock. And we jump into the scores, and let's see, at stock we were getting 2766 and overclock at 3226 with the performance gain of about 17%. Alright, so let's jump into the real world here. We now have Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor with all the ultimate settings at a 2560 by 1440 resolution. And on the left we have the stock settings, and on the right we have the overclock. And what you'll see here is that the performance gains that we saw in the synthetic benchmarks roughly translate to the performance gains that we see in the games that we chose out. Now, my most difficult games for performance are Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, and after this we're going to be looking at Rise of the Tomb Raider, which is much more intense than even Shadow of Mordor. But as you can see, the left is still pretty smooth. Even at stock settings, you know, we're dipping into the low 70s. But on the right with overclock, we're sitting pretty happily in the 90s for most of the benchmarking. We used fraps for getting the min, max, and average frame rates, and we went ahead and plotted those in Excel, and we'll be looking at here in just a minute. Alright, so we can see that the max frames per second stay the same between overclock and stock, but what we really want are the averages, and the averages we see are 81 at stock and 94 on overclock. Alright, now moving on to Rise of the Tomb Raider. Like I said before, this is a much more graphically intensive game. And I didn't even use the 4x SSAA anti-aliasing because the frame rates were hovering more in the 30s with that. So this was much more playable. Now, this isn't like a first-person shooter that really requires a lot of super high frame rates for accuracy. I like to be above 30, just to stick it to my console buddies. But anyways, so we chose to run this at 2x anti-aliasing with ultimate settings. And you'll see here on the left with the stock settings on both the CPU and GPU, we're sitting comfortably in the mid to high 30s, and overclock on the right we're typically in the high 40s to low 50s and sometimes hitting 60. So really, there is a pretty noticeable difference between left and right. You'll see a little bit of stuttering, but not a whole lot on the stock settings, but not too bad. I mean, the Core i7 in combination with the GTX 980 Ti is just a killer combination and can really handle most anything you throw at it. Especially at the 2560 by 1440p resolution settings. I'm not really doing any of the 4K gaming yet. So this is pretty reasonable for single card setup on Skylake. You're gonna get excellent performance with excellent graphics. And plus, it's a really fun game. This is a really fun game. One I wasn't expecting to be as fun as it was. So let's take a quick gander at the scores here for Rise of the Tomb Raider with what we got plotted. So we have The mins on the stock were 34 and overclock 39. The max on the overclock was 61 and stock was 54. And the average on stock was about 41.5, and the overclock average was about 48 frames per second with a performance gain of about 15.5%. So there you have it. Those are the overclocking results of my own personal system. 15% across the board, across all benchmarks, synthetic and gaming. I'm really quite happy with it. It's stable, it doesn't put out a lot of extra heat, and these are settings that we'll probably be keeping for a while. So thanks for watching today. Stay tuned for content every weekend where we will be featuring computers, technology, and reviews. And so stay tuned to the channel. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And I would also like to thank NathanWillis.com for the brand new intro video. You can check them out underneath below in the additional details. And I will catch you next week. Thanks for watching.